And so that brings me to my third and final question. How should we teach history in Islamic education today? I would argue from what preceded that we should teach history in two strands. On one, we should have a history of Islamic thought. Not the chronicles, but thought. The kinds of arguments that great jurists like Shafi'i and Ibn Hanbal would have among themselves. The kind of logic that allowed Umar ibn al-Khattab to change things so radically 6 years after the death of the Prophet and saying things have changed. We need to focus on that. And in that, I think we should focus on a very important part, which has very great relevance to us today, and that is how differences of opinion were dealt with. Now, differences of opinion were remarkably tolerated in the Muslim world in the heyday that we like to think of as the golden period. It was remarkably well tolerated. Even Al-Ma'mun, son of Harun al-Rashid, at the peak of his power, who was supporting the Mu'tazilites, Ibn Hanbal opposed him. All he did was put Ibn Hanbal in jail for a while. As I said, think of the comparable period. In Europe at the time, they would have been burned alive immediately. There would have been no trial, no nothing. So it was a very mild rebuke compared to his time. I'm not saying today that would mean that you would imprison somebody who disagreed with you. But if you are the all-powerful Khalif who ruled from Morocco to India and from Central Asia to Sudan, and somebody disagreed with you and challenged your opinions, putting him in jail for a little while was not that bad in those days. But the principle is there. So I would apply these difference of these two strands to the three issues I would hold as essential for our life in this first 21st century. The first is really the freedom of expression that I've just brought into this topic. Now, in the last few millennia has been one long struggle for the acceptance of human rights by expanding the scope of freedom of choice and action, all of which would not have been possible without the freedom of expression necessary for people to advance ideas that usually at the beginning are not accepted and then gradually become accepted. Remember, everything we take for granted was at one point a minority position. It became a majority position, then finally was widely accepted. So freedom, as much as imagination and boldness, is at the heart of the search for truth and the attainment of knowledge. It is necessary to any viable system of self-government. And therefore, mass ignorance is a breeding ground for intolerance and bigotry, which in turn leads to oppression and tyranny. And therefore, we not only have to defend freedom of expression, we have to practice it in the teaching of Islamic thought. I was delighted when the minister bringing me up pointed out that the name on the building is of a great Shiite scholar. That's what we need, this much greater involvement. Second issue I have to really address because I am ashamed, and that is about the status of women. Now, I think no issue looms larger on the reform agenda than the status of women. It is the ultimate litmus test for whether the predominantly Muslim, not here in Singapore, but the predominantly Muslim and Arab societies have finally made the transition to the 21st century. Short answer is not yet. I was giving the minister some bad examples of some of the practices that we are witnessing right now. But there are some promising movements here and there, and many will say that Islam improved on the condition of women compared to what existed in pre-Islamic Arabia, and that is true, but is totally irrelevant. That was then, and this is now, and the world has more than caught up with that, and in the last 2 centuries has by far surpassed the prevalent status of women in the predominantly Muslim countries. So today we must recapture the progressive stance that we had always in comparison to the times and move to a similarly progressive stand in today's time. And if we do not, our societies will lag behind. Global experience shows that the emerging centrality of women, they are the true vectors of development. There is ample evidence that the key to development lies in the education of girls and the empowerment of women. These are the single most important actions that you can take in any society today. Indeed, women's rights are human rights, and these must be protected by the rule of law, where all are equal before the law and no one is above the law. And speaking from this podium, as a Muslim man and an Arab man, let me be clear. There is no cultural specificity argument that can be tolerated to justify depriving women of their human rights in the name of tradition or to mutilate girls in the name of custom. And there is more. Women are not just the victims of oppression or the vectors of change, they are the artisans of social capital, that lattice of values that is the glue that holds a society together. It is they who repair the torn fabric of communities in difficult post-war conflict situations. They are the custodians of values who nurture these values in the next generation. But we must engage all men in this endeavor. Men must not just be made to understand, they must be mobilized. Women's issues are society's issues, and men must be involved. We need to breathe with two lungs, we need to walk with two legs, and thus we cannot continue to train the woman of tomorrow and leave aside the man of yesterday. We have to change that, and that has to be done. Now, the last point is political thinking for the 21st century. It is said that, probably very correctly said by a distinguished scholar from Asia, that we have hundreds of Islamic schools and universities that now produce hundreds of thousands of Islamic legal scholars, but hardly any produce political theorists or philosophers. So he goes on to say that with some rare exception, this intellectual poverty has reduced Islamic thought to the status of a medieval legal tradition. I regret to say that he is largely right. But a proper reading of that history and that tradition, along the lines that I've outlined today, with the principles and the examples I've given you, is something that we need. We need it to know who we are and where we came from and where we're going. That legacy, the touchstones of our memories and the wellsprings of our imagination. And therefore, let us teach history in a thematic fashion, a lively intercourse of ideas, enriching debate, expanding science, and empowered by a proper understanding of where we came from, we stand secure in our own self-knowledge and not afraid to criticize ourselves, to criticize our past, and to challenge the future. And it's only by doing this and armed with greater understanding from a better understanding of history that we will be able not only to honor the past, but to celebrate the present and also to invent the future. Thank you very much.